The Australian Labor Party is far better than the New Zealand Labor Party or the British Labor Party. The New Zealand Labor Party was hijacked by deranged neoliberal reformers in the 1980s. The British Labor Party is attempting to outflank the Tories to the right. The Australian Labor Party is hardly socialist, but it has been relatively true to its pro-worker values. It never embraced neoliberalism as fanatically as its overseas equivalents did. It never totally abandoned its values like many of its overseas equivalents have. The New Zealand Labor Party has improved since the Rogernomics days, but that legacy still stains it. In New Zealand, Labour is still bickering about whether or not to push for a tax on capital gains. In Australia, Labour introduced one back in the 1980s, and it was introduced and defended by Paul Keating, who was considered a member of the right-wing faction. In New Zealand, Labour has been bickering amongst themselves about this obviously necessary policy for literal decades. The Australian Labor Party had the spine to introduce the policy ages ago. At a time when the New Zealand Labor Party opted to introduce GST and cut top income tax rates. Why raise taxes on the rich when you could raise taxes on the working class to fund tax cuts for the rich? Granted, that was the aberration that was Roger Douglas. The Australian Labor Party never allowed itself to be hijacked by a dishonest, deceitful neoliberal radical. There are other good points of contrast too. Gough Whitlam was basically just a better version of Norman Kirk. He was like Norman Kirk, but without the mindless social conservatism and anti-intellectualism. His list of accomplishments is truly incredible. From foreign policy to welfare policy. You have to go back to the 1940s to find a New Zealand Labour government that did such good. The Australian Labor Party has done a far better job of improving the position of workers. Australia has a tax-free threshold and far stronger trade unions. In New Zealand, these things are considered progressive fantasies by many, even within the Labour Party. It is pretty pathetic. And let's not even mention the hideous disgrace that is the British Labour Party, rambling about cutting red tape and gutting benefits. They want to be the Tories, but more competent. The Australian Labor Party also introduced a superb superannuation scheme, a scheme that has generated great riches for Australia. They forged highly lucrative trade connections with Asia. They built a strong pro-worker welfare state, and they managed to preserve it far better than most. Labour has taken action to crush corruption. They want to put a limit on the size of political donations. They want to impose spending limits on political parties. They want to limit big money influence. Good. This is excellent. This would do massive good. At present, the rich treat elections like auctions. Donations fund advertising, and advertising wins votes. The wealthy should not be able to pour their wealth on the scales to dictate an election result. Big money donations give the wealthy disproportionate political influence. They incentivize politicians to prioritize the interests of the wealthy. These donations should be banned. The Australian Labor Party is taking action to stomp out this corruption. Other Labour parties should follow their lead. I hope to see the Australian Labor Party victorious in the coming election.